Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their diverse stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you would like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. On today's episode, Brandy Schillace joins us to discuss her book about the world's first center for homosexual and transgender rights. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Brandy, always a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure.
I'd love to start out this conversation by learning, where does your story in the autistic community begin?
Oh, wow. Well, that's an excellent question. It has sort of several false starts before it technically starts. You know, I struggled a lot as a child, but was not formally diagnosed. So looking back, it's quite obvious. And my parents knew something was up, but at the time there was quite a lot of stigma, and my mother was sort of adverse to having me tested for things. And so I didn't end up getting tested. I was very touch adverse. I was hyperlexic, so I learned how to talk and to read really early, and had lots of other things. I remember the guiding refrain of my youth was my mother saying, "Please don't be weird in public. Please don't be weird in public." But as an adult, I self-diagnosed because, as you know, women are often underdiagnosed. And it really came down to meeting other autistic people and them saying things like, "So when did you first get your diagnosis?" And I was going, right now, I guess. But it was really, I have to give credit to Eric Garcia, whose book, We're Not Broken, was extremely eye-opening and helped me kind of come out as an autistic person and feel like I could admit that to the world. And then I did that in the most public way possible by writing a Scientific American article about coming out as an autistic person who had been trained since their youth not to do that, to hide a part of themselves. And so it was incredibly freeing, and I'm really glad that it happened. My life was really changed as a result.
Something that I've learned a good deal about in the last couple of years is grief and how it intersects with my autistic experience. So from what I understand, as a child, you went to a lot of funerals. And in thinking about those experiences and grief, I'm wondering if there are ways in which you kind of see being autistic impact your grief, and maybe vice versa.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you say that, because my first trade nonfiction book was called Death's Summer Coat. And it was, I've become sort of a historian in some ways on grief as a ritual and on how we use grief to approach death and dying now, cross-culturally and historically. And I absolutely think there's a lot that overlaps. I personally had to go through a grieving process after my diagnosis because I felt that there was a young me who would have been so much more vibrant and at peace. That person never got to, I am the person I am, and that's good. But there were things you had to be grieving over, relationships, time periods, struggles that you had that you realized didn't need to be there. And I think for me also, I had to give myself some slack because I was angry at myself in some ways for not requiring more accommodation, for not making people aware that I needed accommodation too. Instead, I was running around trying to accommodate everyone else. And I know that's a very common story. But to me, when there's a death, and this is true for pretty much every death, every culture, really, it's more like an amputation. It's, you lose something that you don't get back. And what grief really isn't a getting over the loss, but an adjusting to a life that encapsulates the loss. And I think that that's a lot of what sometimes happens when we come to terms with our autism and the things that we did or didn't get a chance to do.
I really like how you were talking about giving ourselves slack, because I think when we learn about our autism, obviously there's about learning how our brain works, but I think there's also an aspect of unlearning things that, a lot of times well-meaning people have told us that we're not helpful at all. In fact, quite the opposite.
Mhm. Right. Yes, I think so too. I mean, again, I was socialized within an inch of my life, I like to tell people, but I learned a lot of masking, and it took years for me to recognize what parts of my personality were really mine and what I had put on for the sake of other people, and then getting angry at myself for doing it for other people. But you're trying to live in the society in which we find ourselves, and you do what you can.
You're an author of a book that I think is just so critically important, especially where things are right now um, in the United States. The book's
Mhm.
titled Intermediaries and is about the history of a daring team of sexologists who built the first trans clinic in the shadow of the Third Reich. Now, set in interwar Germany, The Intermediaries tells the story of the Institute for Sexual Science, the world's first center for homosexual and transgender rights. So it was headed by a gay Jewish man, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. The Institute aided in the first gender affirming surgeries and hormone treatments, acting as a rebellious base of operations in the face of rising prejudice, nationalism, and Nazi propaganda. So that was a lot there. What do you think are some important things to know about the Institute for Sexual Science, specifically as it relates to some of the horrible laws that have been passed or are attempting to be passed related to the rights of transgender folks present day?
Yes, well, it's uncanny, really. I mean, when I first wanted to write about the Institute for Sexual Science, the point was, wow, what a forward-thinking place, and what amazing work they did in spite of long odds, in spite of prejudice, in spite of hatred. Wouldn't we all love to have a center like that, that's standing up against all of these other things? And then as I was writing it, our country turned toward really similar policies and tactics, and we saw and some of this started in the UK, but it's been weaponized in the United States, and it's an attack against transgender people, which follows very closely the kinds of attacks they saw in Weimar Berlin and before, in fact, because a lot of this prejudice started earlier than that. Magnus Hirschfeld saw what we now consider the wider queer population: gay, homosexual, lesbians, non binary people, which he recognized, I know, all that time ago, bisexual people, and in addition, what we today understand as transgender people. And he noted the way in which particularly nationalist right wing forces attacked them first, almost as a practice, I suppose, practice run before they started going after well, they were also going after women's rights, but before they started really ramping up the anti Semitism that we know is a hallmark of the Nazi regime. And it was interesting how they basically just hopscotched from their anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ sentiments right into anti-Semitism. And they even used Hirschfeld as a way of saying that. They're like, look, he's Jewish and he's supporting these things. So clearly both of these things are terrible and we should go after both of them. And so, there were people who ignored the way that gay, lesbian, transgender people were being treated in this early period as the Nazis began their rise. And then, of course, that was a really bad thing, ignoring that, because it didn't stop there. And that's what we are witnessing today. It's not just that the right has taken to attacking transgender people and saying, trying to suggest that they are somehow this incredibly dangerous group of people when they're not. But they're also attacking women's rights, and we're seeing a rise of anti-Semitism again. So, when you ignore the prejudice against one group, it grows. And it's so uncanny, the parallels between, and they had the law that was on the books in Weimar Berlin was paragraph 175 against homosexuals, but they also had lots of other laws that they used to demonize and to threaten. They would, for instance, transgender people, they made laws that made it illegal to wear the clothes that weren't of your, of your birth gender, etc. And of course, this is ridiculous because it's so broad and wide that you could attack almost anyone, and that's how they used it. So again, the laws that they're passing right now, things that they're claiming erroneously are to protect children are in fact deeply harmful to transgender children and transgender teenagers. But in addition to that, those, if you look at the laws and the language, they're so broad that they're also going after transgender adults and homosexuals, and like they're using those broad languages to attack everyone. And so it's just like I'm watching this happen and thinking, like, who do I need to send this book to? It's happening again.
Everyone, right?
Everyone. Yes.
And it just kind of makes me think about just being here in Ohio, where I'll be on the email list of like Equality Ohio and some other organizations that are really at the forefront against what laws are trying to be passed. I'm just wondering about those that maybe feel like they're not personally affected by some of these laws, and how quickly that if these things are passed could potentially lead to some other incredibly dangerous things.
Absolutely. Like there's escalation already, right? Originally it was, they're like, oh, well, we just want to, they always start, and this was true in the Weimar period too. They start by saying, well, we're just trying to protect children, right? Because they figure everyone will sign on to that. But in fact, what they're doing doesn't protect children and harms children. There is, in one of the reasons that Magnus Hirschfeld became so involved was because of the numbers of suicides. There were such high numbers of suicides that were occurring, and it was, homosexual people who felt alienated, or people who'd been abandoned by their family members. There's a story about on Christmas Eve, a young man whose father kicked him out, and he stands at the window watching his family have Christmas, and he's standing outside, and he goes back to his rooms and he tries to commit suicide, and Hirschfeld saves his life. But Hirschfeld couldn't save them all. And it was this really sad story of the number of young people who were committing suicide. One of the main characters in the book, the first trans woman to undergo modern gender affirming surgery the way we think about it, Dora Richter, tries to commit suicide when she's like 12 or 13 years old. And we have actual statistical data that shows that if you do not provide supportive care to transgender children and teenagers, and this doesn't mean surgery. Everybody jumps to these huge conclusions. It usually just means putting them on a kind of puberty blocker or something that kind of slows down the process of puberty. It doesn't make them go through, extremely, because puberty is hard enough as it is, right? And puberty blockers have been used for years with people who have certain kinds of disorders. And so it's, or who go through puberty too early, or et cetera. So it's not as though it hasn't been used before, but only now is it suddenly a problem, right? And it shows that it saves lives, and it saves children's lives, it saves teenagers' lives. And so you have to deeply question people who are saying, well, we're doing it for the children, because they're not really. They're just using that as a way to try and convince other people that it's, that they're doing the right thing. And it's these days, I can't imagine anybody doesn't know somebody who's LGBTQ somewhere. And I feel like, don't you care about your friends or your family members? I mean, don't you see how damaging these laws are? And even if it doesn't particularly affect you, doesn't it affect people you love? And I'm just astonished that more people don't fight for that.
Some of the other books you've authored have included main characters that are autistic. So I always love these books. So when writing about these characters, what do you think are some important things authors should think about in this process?
Right. Well, it's really interesting because I know lots of times people just write nonfiction or they just write fiction, but I don't know how to stay in my lane, I guess. But I think some of this is related to the fact that I am autistic, and I have lived so much of my life feeling like I'm on the fringes and edges that, and I'm also in the LGBT community. I consider myself to be non-binary, and this is not that unusual. Lots and lots of autistic people cross over into transgender and LGBTQ, and I think a lot of it's because we recognize how performative gender really is, because we're doing performance all the time, trying to, fit in, and we're watching social interactions, and we realize how performative they are. But having lived on the kind of edges and feeling like, there wasn't good representation, and that means there wasn't good representation for gay, lesbian, transgender, etc., asexual, the whole spectrum, and there wasn't good representation for autism in the media that I consumed. And where I did find it, it was, again, shockingly, on the fringes and edges, right? They wouldn't say that a character was gay or autistic. It was always kind of you had to infer it from the details. You had to kind of guess and think, well, maybe. So, what I wanted to do in my nonfiction was to write about the lives, the true history of transgender and LGBTQ rights. But in my fiction, I wanted to take you on a journey inside what it was like to be autistic, but with a character who admits, yes, I am autistic. She claims it. I am an autistic person. And then she, through the course of the books, these are mystery novels, defines herself against many stereotypes. And that's, it's really useful. But it also, I thought, the best way to do that is to have a narrative where you're inside the character's head and there's a second perspective that's outside the character's head, so you can kind of see the disjunction, right? Or how things don't line up the way the people expect.
You mentioned like you don't know how to stay in your lane, and I'm wondering like I'm not a writer like you, but I think of myself as an artist in a lot of other ways, a creative in a lot of ways, and I'm wondering how you look at the creative process and if that reduces creativity when you do stay in like one lane.
I feel so for myself. It's hard to speak for everyone, but I'm sure many of your listeners understand that it's not like we have one special interest, right? We have lots of special interests, and I hopscotch between them, and I find new ones all the time. And so for me, if I have a special interest in mystery. I'm a Sherlockian, I'm deeply obsessed with Sherlock Holmes. I have all the books and all the adaptations, and I have all the shows, and I've read all the books that have been written by people since about Sherlock Holmes, and et cetera, et cetera. So, of course, mystery was something I wanted to try. And just because I kind of got known as a nonfiction writer didn't mean that I thought I had to stay there. Why couldn't I follow one of my other special interests and passions? And so I switched to writing fiction. There's plenty of authors who struggle to get out of the genre, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But to have arbitrary limits on what you can and can't do and which lanes you can occupy, I think is just wrong. I mean, aren't we all interested in like dinosaurs and whales and flowers and bees, and don't we all have that?
Yes, that always amazes me. Now, beyond being an author, you've been an editor for about 20 years. I imagine this could be a job that many autistic people would be good at. I wouldn't be good at it, but I imagine there would be many autistic people that would be good at it. So with just about any job, I wonder how accessible it actually is. So where do you think the editing industry is at in making this a job and career more accessible to neurodivergent people?
Well, about 5 years ago, I would have said that it was opening up. Unfortunately, I feel like things have gotten narrow again with a lot of the anti-DEI backlash, people kind of going against diversity and inclusion, which, how do you go against diversity, equity, and inclusion? Like, how do you be against those things? I just, like, diversity seems good. Equity, inclusion, all seems good. So about 5 years ago, I felt like things were really expanding. Now I'm less certain, but one of the things that made me very good at the role is that I'm highly compartmentalized in the way that I think. And I think that's true of a lot, not all, but lots of autistic and other neurodivergent folk. And that meant that a job that requires you to, I was an editor for a medical humanities journal, and before that, an anthropology journal. And you have to do a lot of things. You have to, there's a lot of administrative stuff, but in addition to that, there's a lot of working with authors, and there's actually editing text, and there's working with the higher ups of the publication industry, and there's outreach, and there's all of these things. And I think for someone who wasn't good at compartmentalization, it looks like a big soup pot of stuff, and it can be very overwhelming. But they just all lived in their own little sections for me. And I'd be like, well, today I'm doing this, and tomorrow I'm doing that, or this hour I'm doing this, and that hour I'm doing that. And I was able to switch between them without too much trouble. And also, I didn't really find it tedious to do so. A lot of people talk about how, well, the administration stuff is boring, but I like the little checking of boxes. I'm quite fond of box checking. I like that. So yeah, I was uniquely good at it. I did it for a long, long time, over two different journals. And, I think that In fact, you might be uniquely qualified if you have that ability to compartmentalize, and it's a good place to be.
I definitely love box checking as well. Just don't put me in a box. Autonomy, autonomy is critical for me. Now here at Autism Stories, we've had over 400 episodes, but I think you're the first person that I've interviewed to host a variety show. So what can
Yes.
you tell us about your variety show, The Peculiar Book Club?
Okay, so I do a lot of things, right? So I write nonfiction and I write mystery fiction, and I'm autistic, and I'm also, I'm in the LGBTQ community. And so there's all these facets of myself. And as I mentioned, all those facets have not exactly haven't been treated centrally by our culture, right? It's like you shove all of these things to the sides, and we're often not the center of people's focus. And of course, I'm socialized and still consider myself she, her, and women are another one that's sort of shoved off to the side, and the people of color and et cetera are others. So I think that it's a place where you can be, and it's an opening up of things, but you also have to invite community. You have to be in community. And sometimes that means making something that doesn't exist yet in the world. So when I went out, thought, okay, I'm a nonfiction writer and I'm a fiction writer and I'm all of these things. Where is my group? Where are they? And there wasn't a place. And I thought, well, there really should be. So I decided to make one. And the Peculiar Book Club, our tagline is, if you're weird, you're family. And it's basically a big found family of people, many of whom are also neurodivergent or in the LGBT community, all different ages, all different interests. And we come together and it is like a book club. We do read books, but I also bring in, and these are live streams, authors so that you can talk to the authors. You can chat with them. We use the text feature of YouTube. So it's not voices, it's text chatting. And then I thought, well, I don't just want it to be talking heads, right? We all have many interests. So we added comedy sketches and live music. And one of my hyper focus special interests is doing stop motion animation. So I started doing stop motion animation for the openings and closings. And I started, sometimes for doing little skits. We did puppet shows. In fact, I kind of tell people that the Peculiar Book Club is sort of like the Muppet Show if it were run by Morticia Addams if she was a librarian.
That sounds like, I mean, who wouldn't like that?
It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. It was a lot of work to get off the ground. We're in our 6th season, getting ready for our 7th season next year. And I guess the biggest thing I would say is finding a place where it's very hard. There's not a central location where everybody hangs out anymore, right? Some people are on Facebook and some people are on Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever. So we ended up basically making a presence in lots of social media channels to kind of advertise that we were there and say, hey, this is something we're doing. The other thing is the authors that we got involved were really key. They themselves pushed us out to their networks. We had Mary Roach. Mary Roach has been on the show. If you're not familiar with her, she wrote Stiff and Gulp and a number of other very strange nonfiction books. She was wonderful. Like, she's been on our show several times, always pushes it out to all of her fans. And, it's like you sent up that peculiar, weird, neurodivergent flair, and people began to flock to us. But it definitely took a couple of years to get off the ground.
And lastly, Brandy, how can our listeners learn more about you, the intermediaries, and all of your books?
One is that I'm helpfully named after alcohol. So my first name is Brandy, spelled like, the kind you drink. And my last name, which is hard to spell and pronounce, is Schillace, and it's Schillace. And it just so happens that that's an Italian last name, and my first name is a French liqueur, and there are no other people who have made that combination. So if you Google Brandy Schillace, I am the only one. And you'll probably come up with my website, which is brandyschillace.com. And there you can see The Intermediaries, which is already out. My last my last fiction book, The Framed Women of Ardmore House, which came out last year and won an award. And that one is out now. And its sequel, The Dead Come to Stay, comes out August 5th.
Well, I have not had the honor of reading the intermediaries yet, but that is the next book that I'm going to read. I'm very excited about that. So thanks so much for that book, and thanks so much for having a conversation with me here on Autism Stories.
This is wonderful, and I'm so glad that you do this. I think this is really important and a great show. And thank you all for listening.
Thanks so much to Brandy for the conversation. To learn more about Brandy and all her books, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. We always love hearing from you and would especially love to hear from you relating to this episode regarding how do you think we can best support the LGBTQIA plus community right now? Did you know Autism Personal Coach provides neurodiversity affirming support by autistics for autistics? We empower autistic adults and teens to be the best version of their authentic selves through customized life coaching and community groups. We also support parents and partners of autistic people by providing insights and guidance to bridge communication gaps and nurture mutual understanding. So please visit autismpersonalcoach.com to begin your experience of judgment-free coaching rooted in empathy, expertise, and respect for autistic identity. Until next time, I'm Doug Blutcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.